you. Thank you very much. So, next up we have me. Introduce myself, why not? Talking about reform and the Greens in the 2024 local election. So, one of the stories of the election was just how poorly reform did, from kind of any reasonable expectation. If we think back to the images from the polling that we saw from Andrew then, you know, they've overtook in some polls the Lib Dems, certainly the Greens, and yet they only contested 16% of wards. They came first in none of the wards. They won 2 seats, but in both cases, I believe they were third place behind 2 Conservative candidates. So no first place victories and 2 seats. So not a good showing, especially when you compare it to the Greens, doing much worse in the polls nationally, but 74% they contested, so a good showing, shows a solid ground game. First place in 9% and won in 7% of the seats they stood. And then you've got kind of all of these other, the other kind of interesting story was the Women's Equality Party winning their first seat as well in a local election. But we'll just talk about reform and the Greens today. And I think the important comparison here for reform is with UKIP in their local government heyday, which was 2013, 2014. We'll ignore 2015 because the locals were on the same day as the general, and that inevitably messes up the dynamics there. But so we can just put this into a bit more context. UKIP 2013, 2014, opinion polls 10 to 17%, 11 to 20%. Reform doing fairly similar there on the national level, 10 to 15%. But that's polls, and when we get to real elections, Reform are performing much worse. So getting roughly less than half the aggregate vote share. If we look again at the wards, they only contested 16% compared to 3/4 in the 2013 heyday. Again, like I said, they came first in no seats compared to 8% where they came first in 2013, 7% in 2014. And then I think that the really interesting bit is actually the places where they came second place. In half of seats that were up in 2013 pretty much, UKIP came second. And if you look at second place in Liverpool, for instance, huge swathes of North Liverpool were second place UKIP. Yeah, admittedly, Labour were getting like 70% of the vote. Kim Jong-un was looking over jealously. But UKIP, they're still there on a like 10% in places like Kirkdale, in fact, Warbrett, loads of places up North Liverpool. Compare that to 33% in these elections. So 33 seats, 11% in these elections. And then of the seats available, so it's different from the wards, obviously, because multiple seats in single wards. UKIP, 6%, 4%, compared to 0.08%. I was going to just leave that, not rounded up to 0, but I thought that's a bit mean. Got to give them some hope. And so one of the things that I did, which was made difficult by the poor Wi-Fi by Transport for Wales, but was to take the census data from the wards that UKIP won in 2013 and 14, look at the type of demographic context that they did well and try to predict the vote share for UKIP then, and then apply that model to Reform today. And essentially, if we wanted to see that that Reform were performing as well as UKIP did in the seats they stood, given the socio-demographic context, we would expect the line of best fit to be on par with the black horizontal line. But because it's under that, we can see that actually Reform is doing worse than UKIP. Because the line is closer to being flat than it is to being the same as the kind of horizontal one, the better the ward looks like, i.e. the more UKIP-y the ward looks, the worse Reform is doing relative to what it should be doing. So it's almost like it's not proportionate. So they're doing worse in areas that they should be doing better. And you could probably think of a range of reasons why this is the case. But the fact that they only stood 300-odd candidates is a sign that the ground game is not there. And the news emerging of Tice having to bankroll a party for like 90% of its funding or whatever just suggests that this is a movement. It's not actually really a party, is it? It's an organised business. Don't know how many members Reform has. 3. Minimum that you need to be registered with the Electoral Commission. Everyone else is a registered supporter. Other parties that did things like that, Berlusconi's Forza Italia, so but the Reform parties are probably less good. So the issue there is that actually the ground game is not there in a way that it is for the Greens, and the way that it probably still is for the Lib Dems, which is that they can punch above their weight in the polls in a way that Reform actually can't. And so, although undoubtedly it seems they will do damage to the Conservatives if they stand in seats against them, and that will be doubly so if Farage comes back, fundamentally, even the star power of Farage can't outdo a poor ground game. So that's Reform, and that's the kind of core message there, is that actually they're not really fulfilling their UKIP peak. Yeah, sorry about this. Don't worry, we'll spend time. The idea here isn't so much that you need to actually be able to read it. You just need to take it in. It's all vibes. So again, looked at the Greens undoubtedly did very well, right? So they're now on 800 odd councillors, and they won. So I've got it written here. So they won 181 seats. Really, really good performance from the Greens, and often they're seen. The rhetoric nationally is that they're seen as a challenge to Labour on the left. But this doesn't necessarily relate to the types of areas where they're winning. And so you've got the Green Party winning for people from the region in seats, in quite affluent seats, but also in places like, say, Birkenhead, that don't look like traditional green areas. And so I wanted to look at the types of places where the Greens are winning, and essentially using the same kind of socio-economic census data, you get 3 different clusters that really come out. And I won't spend too much time on this, but if you think this is bad. But again, you don't need to know. This is just to show I didn't just make this up. And I've got 3 different groups here that represent the areas that the Greens are winning in. One is called affluent managers. So these are the wards where actually people are quite well off. They tend to have what is classified as a good job. They tend to have high levels of qualifications, and so that's the red box plot. They tend to live in areas that are less dense, and so on. And so they are your kind of middle class Green voters, and they live in wards that typically would have a strong Conservative showing. And so you can see that they're basically they're the Labour opposition in areas that Labour doesn't do well in. Then you also get the blue box charts, which I've just kind of labelled, because I was struggling at this point, I won't lie, precarious, educated, young, which is less a label and more just 3 descriptive words, isn't it? But this gives you a sense of what they're about, and these are, again, well educated. So like the first group, they are well educated, generally kind of like, they have things like good health, they're less likely to identify as English they're younger as well. Obviously, that's part of the label. But although they're well educated, they're not necessarily affluent, and so they live in areas with, say, for instance, VAR-DEP 4 there is levels of indices of multiple deprivation. They score highly on 4 of them, right? They live in areas that are much more dense, so think students, young professionals, so on. And perhaps an example of that in Liverpool might be the St Michael's ward. I'm not sure if it's still called that for the boundary reform, but that area there where people are starting out in their careers, maybe just graduated. And then you get this this kind of green box shot, which looks like they're in between, but actually in some important ways they're quite different from both of those groups. And I call these the kind of left behind Labour areas, and I don't think that's a good name, and I'd quite like to think of a different name. But in some ways they look, so they tend to be less well qualified, tend to be less likely to be managers, they're less likely to own their home, they're less likely to have good health, for instance, more likely to be things like a single parent, more likely than, say, the precarious educated young to be white. So again, they're kind of more cosmopolitan in their outlook, but suffer, and these are just generalisations about areas, these are not generalisations about the individuals, because you can't do that from this type of data, but they do tend to also have some economic issues as well. And so what this kind of speaks to us is actually the Greens are doing what the Liberals used to be able to do, and what kind of pavement politics focused local parties have done in the past, which is appeal to different groups in different areas with different messages. And that's great until you actually have to have a single appeal, and then when you realise you can't be everything to everyone, something has to give. It's all very preliminary, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. But I just think it's an interesting way of approaching the types of areas that the Greens are doing well, because I think actually it really is underreported, and I think as they become a greater presence in local government, and as they start to kind of run councils and things like that, they'll come under greater scrutiny, and they might struggle to face that scrutiny because actually a light is being shone on what they're saying to one set of people compared to another.